Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers. Before the ideas begin, a small request: most of you who watch are not subscribed, and we've noticed this in the numbers, in the gap between views and the audience that stays. We post every single day, we put care into each script, each thought, each question that unfolds in the dark, and if these videos have become part of your nights, if they help you think or drift, or simply exist in that space between waking and sleep, consider subscribing, hitting the like button, turning on notifications so you know when the next one arrives. And if you feel moved to do so, leave a comment, tell us where you're watching from. What philosophical question occupies your mind the most? What idea you return to when everything else falls away? These small gestures matter more than you might think. They allow this work to continue. They allow these ideas to reach others like you, scattered across the world, awake in the quiet hours. Now the introduction ends and the philosophy begins. Pain does not end with the person who experiences it, does not die with the body that carried it, but persists, transmits, moves through generations like a current that flows beneath consciousness, shaping those who come after in ways they do not understand, in ways they cannot name. And this transmission is not metaphorical, is not merely the passing of stories or the modelling of behaviour, though it includes those things, but is written into biology, into the methylation patterns on genes, into the expression profiles that determine which parts of the genetic code are active and which are silenced. And the silencing is not random, is not arbitrary, but is responsive to experience, to environment, to the stresses that the organism faces. And when the stress is severe, when the trauma is overwhelming, when the suffering exceeds what can be processed and integrated, the organism adapts, changes its expression patterns, alters the way genes function, and these alterations persist, are maintained across cell divisions, across the lifespan, and in some cases, across generations, are passed to children who never experienced the original trauma but carry its signature in their cells, in their stress response systems, in the heightened reactivity that makes them vulnerable to threats that their parents faced but they have not. And the vulnerability is not chosen, is not learned, is inherited, is biological, is the body remembering what the mind never knew. And the remembering is not conscious, is not available to introspection, is only visible in symptoms, in patterns of response, in the ways that descendants of trauma survivors react to the world, and the reactions are often excessive, are disproportionate to present circumstances, are responding not to what is happening now, but to what happened then, to the grandmother who starved, to the grandfather who was tortured, to the ancestors who were enslaved or displaced or murdered. And the murdered are not gone, are not finished, are still speaking through the bodies of the living, through the nervous systems that were shaped by their suffering, through the epigenetic marks that carry forward the biological memory of what was done. And what was done cannot be undone, cannot be erased, cannot be forgotten, because it is not stored in memory, but in structure, in the physical organisation of the organism, in the ways that cells respond to signals, in the thresholds for activation, in the baseline levels of stress hormones. And these levels are set during development, are calibrated by the environment the developing organism encounters. And if the mother is traumatized, if she is living in fear, if her stress systems are chronically activated, the fetus is bathed in cortisol, in the chemical signatures of danger. And the developing brain adapts, prepares, assumes the world will be hostile. And this assumption is not a thought but a configuration, is the wiring of neural circuits, the tuning of receptor densities, the establishment of set points that will persist long after birth, long after the original danger has passed. And the passing is not complete, is not final, because the danger is not just external, but is now internal, is part of the organism's structure, is the way it has been built. And the building is what trauma does, is the remodeling of the organism to survive threats that may or may not continue to exist. And when the threats do not continue, when the environment becomes safe, The organism does not automatically adjust, does not recalibrate, because the recalibration is difficult, is requiring new experiences, new safety, sustained over time. And even then the original programming is not erased, but is overlaid, is suppressed, but remains available, remains capable of being reactivated if circumstances change, if danger returns, and the return is expected, is anticipated by systems that were shaped by trauma, that are always waiting for the threat to appear, and the waiting is exhausting, is the chronic activation that wears down the body, that accelerates aging, that produces illness that shortens life, and the shortening is transmitted, is part of the inheritance, is what descendants receive, along with the shape of the face and the colour of the eyes. They receive the legacy of suffering, the biological record of what their ancestors endured, and the enduring is not over, is continuing in the present. In the bodies that carry forward the marks, in the lives that are shaped by reactivity they did not choose, by fear they did not earn, by suffering that is not theirs but is in them, is part of them, is what they are, and what they are is not just themselves, but the accumulation of generations, the layering of experience, the sedimentation of pain, and the pain is collective, is not belonging to individuals but to lineages, to communities, to peoples who have been subjected to violence, to oppression, to the systematic destruction of culture and identity, and the destruction is not complete, is never complete, because the people persist, the lineages continue, the communities survive, but the survival is not unchanged, is not untouched, is carrying the wounds, the scars, the alterations that trauma produced, and the production is ongoing, is not a single event, but a process, a transgenerational process where the effects of trauma in one generation become the conditions for trauma in the next, become the vulnerabilities, the sensitivities, the propensities that make descendants more likely to suffer, more likely to develop disorders, more likely to struggle with the same demons that haunted their parents. And the haunting is not superstition, is not folklore, is biology, is the way that history writes itself onto bodies, into genomes, into the regulatory systems that determine which genes are expressed and which are silenced. And the silencing is sometimes protective, is sometimes adaptive, is turning off genes that would be harmful in a dangerous environment. But the protection becomes problem when the environment changes, when safety returns, when the genes that were silenced are needed again, and the need is not met, the genes remain silent, and the organism functions at reduced capacity, functions as if still in danger, still in deprivation, still in the conditions that shaped its ancestors. And the shaping is transmission, is the way that trauma moves across time, inhabits new bodies, new lives, without ever announcing itself, without ever being recognized for what it is. And what it is inheritance, is the legacy that no one chose, that no one wanted, that is carried nonetheless, is carried in silence, in shame, in the unspoken sense that something is wrong, that something is broken, that the self is damaged in ways that cannot be explained, that make no sense given the safety of the present, given the absence of direct trauma, but the absence is not complete, is not real, because the trauma is present, is here, is in the body, in the nervous system, in the patterns of reactivity that were established before birth, before consciousness, before the possibility of choice. And choice is not available, is not part of this inheritance, because the inheritance is automatic, is biological, is not something that can be refused or returned, is only something that can be carried, can be lived with, can be passed forward unless the cycle is broken. And breaking the cycle is difficult, is requiring awareness, is requiring intervention, is requiring that the trauma be recognized, be named, be brought into consciousness where it can be processed, where it can be integrated, where its grip can be loosened. But the loosening is not guaranteed, is not automatic, is requiring work, is requiring therapy, is requiring the creation of new experiences, new safety, new patterns that can override the old. And the override is partial, is incomplete, is never total, because the old patterns are deep, are foundational, are part of the structure, and structure is resistant to change, is maintaining itself, is reproducing itself, is the reason why trauma persists, why it transmits, why descendants find themselves struggling with issues that seem to come from nowhere, that have no clear source in their own experience, but are rooted in the experience of those who came before. And those who came before are not past, are not gone, are present in the bodies of the living, are speaking through symptoms, through patterns, through the reactivity that makes no sense until the history is known, until the lineage is traced, until the connection is made between present suffering and past trauma. And the connection is not always visible, is not always traceable, because the transmission is not direct, is not conscious, is happening at levels below awareness, in the biology, in the epigenetics, in the ways that genes are regulated, and regulation is the mechanism, is how the environment gets under the skin, how experience becomes biology, how trauma writes itself into the code, not by changing the sequence but by changing the expression, by adding methyl groups to the DNA, by modifying histones, by altering the accessibility of genes to the transcription machinery. And these alterations are reversible in principle, are not mutations, are not permanent changes to the sequence, but in practice they are stable, are persisting, are passed to daughter cells when cells divide, are sometimes passed to offspring when gametes form, and the passing is the inheritance, is the way that trauma becomes. Transgenerational becomes a legacy that spans lifetimes, that spans centuries, that connects descendants to ancestors they never met, whose names they do not know, whose suffering they do not remember, but nonetheless carry in their bodies, in their stress responses, in their vulnerabilities, and the vulnerabilities are real, are biological, are making descendants more sensitive to stress, more reactive to threat, more likely to develop PTSD, more likely to suffer from anxiety, from depression, from the disorders that cluster in families, not just because of genes, but because of the regulatory changes that genes undergo in response to trauma. And the response is adaptive in the moment, is helping the organism survive, but becomes maladaptive when transmitted. When the environment no longer matches the adaptations, when the descendants are living in safety, but their bodies are prepared for war, and the war is historical, is not present, but the preparation persists, is the mismatch that creates suffering, that makes normal life difficult, that makes challenges overwhelming, that produces symptoms that seem excessive, that are judged by others as weakness, as overreaction, as personal failing, when really they are the inheritance, are the biological legacy of trauma that was not chosen, was not earned, was simply received, was transmitted through mechanisms that the descendants did not control and usually do not understand. And the understanding is what begins healing, is what makes intervention possible, is what allows the cycle to be recognized as cycle, as pattern, as something that is not inevitable, is not destiny, is not the way things have to be, but is the way things have been, is the history, is the accumulation of pain across generations, and the accumulation can be interrupted, can be metabolized, can be processed in ways that prevent further transmission, and the prevention is not easy, is not simple, is requiring that the inherited trauma be made conscious, be brought into awareness, be given language, be placed in context, be understood, not as personal failing, but as historical wound, as the legacy of violence, of oppression, of collective trauma that was inflicted on communities, on peoples, on entire lineages, and the lineages carry forward the marks, carry forward the biological memory, carry forward the heightened reactivity, the altered stress responses, the vulnerabilities that are not weaknesses but are adaptations, are the ways that organisms prepared themselves and their descendants for survival in hostile conditions. And the conditions have changed, but the preparations remain in the epigenetics, in the gene expression patterns, in the methylation marks that persist across cell divisions, across lifetimes, across generations. And the generations are connected not just by culture, not just by story, not just by memory, but by biology, by the physical inheritance of trauma's effects. And the effects are measurable, are detectable, are visible in studies of Holocaust survivors and their children, in studies of famine survivors and their grandchildren, in studies of enslaved peoples and their descendants. And the descendants show the marks, show the alterations, show the biological signatures of trauma they never directly experienced. And the indirect experience is the mechanism, is the transmission through mother's stress during pregnancy, through father's sperm at conception, through the intrauterine environment, through the early years when the nervous system is being wired, when the stress response systems are being calibrated, when the organism is learning what kind of world it has been born into. And the learning is not cognitive, is not conscious, is happening at the level of physiology, is setting the baseline, is establishing the patterns that will persist. And the persistence is the problem, is the reason why trauma is transgenerational, is why the effects extend beyond the traumatized generation to those who come after, who inherit not just the memory, but the biology, not just the story, but the structure, not just the narrative, but the nervous system that was shaped by suffering. And the shaping is inheritance, is what cannot be escaped, is what is carried forward until it is metabolized, until it is processed, until the cycle is broken by someone who recognizes what is happening, who understands the transmission, who does the work of healing, not just for themselves, but for the lineage, for the ancestors, whose suffering is still present, still active, still shaping lives, and for the descendants who will either inherit the trauma or inherit the healing, will either receive the unprocessed pain or will receive the integration, the metabolization, the transformation of trauma into wisdom, into resilience, into the capacity to bear what was unbearable. And the bearing is what breaks the cycle, is what prevents transmission, is what allows the next generation to be free of the burden, to live without the reactivity, without the hypervigilance, without the sense that danger is everywhere, that safety is illusion, that the world is hostile and the hostility is historical, is real in the sense that it happened, that it shaped bodies, that it left marks, but is not present, is not current, is not the reality that descendants face, except that it is present in them, is current in their physiology, is the reality they inhabit, because their bodies are still responding to threats that are generations old. And the old is not past, is not finished, is ongoing in the biological present, in the stress response that activates too easily, in the immune system that is dysregulated, in the inflammatory markers that are elevated, in all the ways that trauma persists in the body long after the traumatic event has ended. And when the body that persists is not the body that was traumatized, but is the body of a descendant, then the transmission is visible, is undeniable, is proof that trauma is not contained within individuals, but spreads across time, across generations, becomes the inheritance that shapes families, communities, peoples. And the shaping is not deterministic, is not fate, is not making the future inevitable, but is making certain futures more likely, is creating vulnerabilities, is establishing patterns that will repeat unless interrupted, unless metabolized, unless transformed through the difficult work of bringing the unconscious into consciousness, the biological into awareness, the inherited into the examined. And the examination is what makes change possible, is what allows descendants to recognize that what they feel is not just theirs, is not just personal, is not just individual pathology, but is the echo of historical trauma, is the reverberation of suffering that originated elsewhere in the lives of ancestors who endured what should not have been endured, who survived what should not have been survived. And the survival is the transmission, is the passing forward of the marks, the scars, the alterations that survival required. And the requirement is what makes the inheritance unavoidable, is what makes the dead still speak, still influence, still shape the living, because the dead are not gone, are not finished, are present in the bodies of descendants, are present in the epigenetics, in the gene expression, in the reactivity, in the vulnerabilities, in all the ways that trauma persists beyond the traumatized, becomes transgenerational, becomes collective, becomes the wound that a people carries, that a lineage inherits, that cannot be healed by individuals alone, but requires collective recognition, collective processing, collective transformation, and the transformation is possible, is happening, is the work of those who recognize the inheritance, who refuse to pass it forward, who do the difficult work of metabolizing historical trauma, of breaking cycles that have persisted for generations, of healing not just themselves, but the lineage, the ancestors, the descendants, the entire chain of transmission. And the breaking is not erasure, is not forgetting, is not denying what happened, but is integrating, is processing, is transforming the raw wound into scar tissue, into wisdom, into the capacity to remember without being destroyed by the remembering. And the remembering is necessary, is what prevents repetition, is what honors the suffering, is what ensures that the dead are not forgotten, that their pain is not invisible, that their legacy is not silence but speech, is not erasure but presence, is not void but the acknowledgement that they still matter, still shape, still influence, still speak through the bodies of the living, through the inherited patterns, through the transgenerational transmission of trauma that makes history not past but present, not finished but ongoing, not ended but continuing in the lives of descendants who carry forward the marks, the wounds, the biological memory of what was done. And what was done cannot be undone, but can be transformed, can be metabolized, can be released from its hold on the future, can be prevented from transmitting further. And the prevention is the work, is the healing, is the breaking of cycles that cannot break themselves, that require consciousness, require intention, require the difficult recognition that the pain being felt is not just personal, but is inherited, is collective, is historical, and that healing it requires more than individual therapy, requires acknowledgement, requires witnessing, requires the collective processing of collective trauma, and the processing is happening, is the work of communities, of peoples, of lineages who are recognizing the inheritance, who are naming the trauma, who are bringing into consciousness what was unconscious, into language what was biological, into the examined what was automatic. And the examination is what allows transformation, what allows the cycle to end, what allows descendants to live without the burden, to inherit not trauma but resilience, not wound but wisdom, not pain but the capacity to bear pain without being destroyed by it. And the bearing is what breaks the cycle, is what ends the transmission, is what allows the dead finally to rest, to stop speaking through symptoms, through suffering, through the bodies of the living, and to become instead memory, story, history, the acknowledged past that shapes but does not determine, that influences but does not control, that matters but does not trap. And the trap is what trauma creates, is the cycle that repeats, is the inheritance that persists until it is seen, until it is named, until it is brought into the light where it can be examined, can be understood, can be transformed from curse into legacy, from burden into gift, from wound into wisdom. And the wisdom is what can be passed forward, is what can be inherited, is what can replace the trauma in the transgenerational transmission. And the replacement is possible, is happening, is the work of healing that extends across time, that heals not just the present, but the past, not just the self, but the lineage, not just the individual, but the collective. And the collective is what trauma targets, what trauma fragments, what trauma destroys. And the collective is what healing restores, what processing rebuilds, what transformation makes possible again, the sense of belonging, of continuity, of connection across generations. And the connection is what makes the inheritance bearable, is what converts trauma into meaning, suffering into purpose, pain into the possibility of preventing further pain. And the prevention is the inheritance that can replace trauma, is the legacy that can break cycles, is what the dead want, have always wanted, which is not to haunt but to rest, not to burden but to bless, not to wound but to protect. And the protection comes through the metabolization of their trauma, through the breaking of the cycles they could not break, through the healing they could not achieve, and achieving it now, in the present, heals not just the future, but the past, heals the ancestors whose suffering is still active, still present, still transmitting, and the healing stops the transmission, releases them, releases the descendants, releases everyone from the cycle, from the inheritance, from the weight of pain that has travelled too far, lasted too long, harmed too many, and can finally end, can finally be transformed, can finally become not trauma but memory, not wound but scar, not curse but the story of survival, of endurance, of the refusal to let trauma be the final word. And the final word is healing, is transformation, is the breaking of cycles that seemed unbreakable, the ending of inheritances that seemed inevitable, the release from the past that makes the future possible, makes life livable, makes descendants free to be themselves, rather than the repositories of ancestral pain. And the freedom is the gift, is what healing makes possible, is what the work achieves, is the inheritance that can replace trauma, the legacy that can be passed forward, the blessing that can travel across generations, not as wound but as wisdom, not as pain but as the capacity to transform pain. And the transformation is what matters, is what makes the inheritance of trauma not destiny but opportunity, not curse but challenge, not the end of possibility but the beginning of healing that can reach backward and forward, can touch the dead and the unborn, can break cycles and begin new ones. And the new ones are what the work is for, what the healing aims toward, what makes the difficult metabolization of inherited trauma worth doing, because it frees not just the self, but the lineage, not just the present, but the past and future. And the freeing is what ends the transmission, what stops the cycle, what allows trauma finally to be finished, to be over, to be transformed from the weight that crushes into the wisdom that strengthens. And the strengthening is the inheritance that descendants deserve, is what the work achieves, is what makes the pain of ancestors not meaningless but meaningful, not wasted but transformed, not the end but the beginning of healing that can extend as far into the future as trauma extended into the present. And the extension is what breaks the curse, what ends the haunting, what allows the dead finally to rest and the living finally to be free. Consciousness all the way down. There is a view so strange, so counterintuitive, so apparently absurd that most philosophers dismiss it without argument. The view that consciousness is not something that emerges in complex biological systems, but is fundamental to reality itself, that electrons have experience, that atoms feel, that rocks possess some primitive form of awareness. And this view is called panpsychism, and it has been held by philosophers from the pre-Socratics through Leibniz and Spinoza to contemporary thinkers who argue that panpsychism is not absurd but necessary, not a failure of reason, but the only solution to the hard problem of consciousness, the only way to explain how subjective experience arises in a physical universe. Because if consciousness is not fundamental, then it must emerge from non-conscious matter. An emergence of this kind seems impossible, seems like magic, seems to violate everything we know about how properties arise from components. And panpsychism avoids this problem by denying the premise, by insisting that consciousness does not emerge because it was there all along, present in some form at every level of reality. And if this seems crazy, it is only because we have inherited assumptions about matter being dead, inert, purely physical, in some narrow sense that excludes experience. But these assumptions are not forced on us by evidence, are not required by physics, are philosophical additions that might be wrong. That might be the source of the hard problem rather than constraints on its solution. The hard problem of consciousness, formulated most clearly by Chalmers, is the problem of explaining why there is something it is like to be a conscious organism, why physical processes in the brain are accompanied by subjective experience, by qualia, by the felt quality of seeing red or tasting coffee or feeling pain. And this is distinct from the easy problems, the problems of explaining how the brain processes information, how it responds to stimuli, how it controls behavior, because these are problems about function and mechanism, problems that neuroscience can address through standard scientific methods. But the hard problem is different, is about the existence of experience itself, about why the physical processes do not happen in the dark, why there is an inner life, a perspective, a what it is likeness, and no amount of information about neural firing patterns or computational processes seems to explain this, seems to bridge the gap between objective physical description and subjective felt experience. And this explanatory gap has led some philosophers to conclude that consciousness cannot be explained in physical terms, cannot be reduced to brain processes, cannot be naturalized, and this leads either to dualism, the view that consciousness is a separate substance that interacts with matter, or to panpsychism, the view that consciousness is a fundamental feature of matter itself, present at every level, and panpsychism has seemed to many the less radical option, the one that preserves physicalism while acknowledging that physicalism must include consciousness, must expand our conception of what matter is rather than adding a separate mental substance. Nagel argued that the subjective character of experience is not captured by any functional or behavioral or physical description, that there is something it is like to be a bat that objective science cannot access, that the first-person perspective is irreducible to third-person description, and this does not force dualism, does not require that consciousness be non-physical, but it does require expanding what we mean by physical, recognizing that physics as currently formulated describes only the relational structure of matter, only how things interact and behave, only the extrinsic properties, and it leaves the intrinsic nature of matter unspecified, leaves open what matter is in itself apart from its relations. And this is where panpsychism enters, suggesting that the intrinsic nature of matter is experiential, that what it is like from the inside is consciousness or proto-consciousness, that the same entity can be described from the outside in terms of mass and charge and spin, and from the inside in terms of experience. And these are not two substances, but two aspects of one substance. And this is Russellian monism, the view that physics describes structure and consciousness describes the intrinsic nature that realizes that structure. And this makes consciousness fundamental without making it supernatural, integrates mind into nature without reducing it to mechanism, preserves the insights of both physicalism and the irreducibility of consciousness. But panpsychism faces a devastating objection: the combination problem, the problem of how. Micro-experiences combine into macro-experiences, how the consciousness of electrons and atoms and molecules adds up to the unified consciousness of a human being. Because combination seems impossible, seems to face the same kind of explanatory gap that emergence faces. Because if each particle has its own experience, how do those experiences combine into a single unified experience? Why is there one stream of consciousness associated with a brain rather than trillions of separate microconsciousnesses? And saying they combine does not explain anything, does not tell us what combination means for consciousness, does not give us any idea of the mechanism or the principles that govern it. And this is the hardest problem for panpsychism, the place where the view seems to fail, seems to offer no advantage over emergence, because combination is just emergence under a different name. is just the same mystery relocated from the relationship between non-conscious matter and consciousness to the relationship between micro-consciousness and macro-consciousness. Goff and others have tried to solve the combination problem by distinguishing different senses of combination, by arguing that phenomenal combination is different from physical combination, that consciousness combines holistically rather than additively, that the right model is not addition where parts contribute independently, but something more organic where parts are transformed by their relations to wholes, where the micro-experiences are modified by being part of a larger system in ways that create genuinely new experiences at the macro level. But critics argue this just pushes the problem back, just replaces the mystery of emergence with the mystery of holistic combination, and we still have no account of how it works. No principles that predict which combinations of micro-experiences produce which macro-experiences. No explanation of why human brains produce unified consciousness while rocks do not. And without such an account, panpsychism is just a label for the mystery rather than a solution to it. Coleman proposes that combination happens through overlapping wave functions in quantum mechanics, that when particles become entangled, their wave functions overlap, and their experiences blend into a unified experience. And this would give a physical mechanism for phenomenal combination, would explain how micro-experiences unite into macro-experiences through a well-understood physical process. But this proposal faces problems. Problems about whether entanglement really produces the right kind of unity. Problems about whether quantum mechanics applies at the level of neurons and brains, or only at the micro level. Problems about whether experiences can really blend the way wave functions superpose. And most philosophers remain unconvinced, remain skeptical that quantum mechanics solves the combination problem rather than just relocating it to a different domain. The boundary problem is related, the problem of where one conscious subject ends and another begins. Because if consciousness is present at every level, then why is there not one unified cosmic consciousness? Why are there separate subjects at all? Why does my consciousness end at the boundary of my body rather than extending to include everything? And panpsychism seems to have no principled answer, seems to allow for arbitrary boundaries, seems to make the existence of separate subjects as mysterious as the existence of consciousness itself. And this is another way the view fails to explain what it set out to explain. Another place where it encounters problems as hard as the ones it was meant to solve. Leibniz had a version of panpsychism. His monads were simple substances that had perception and appetition, that experienced the world from their own perspective, and he argued that complex beings were aggregates of monads, that each monad mirrored the entire universe from its own point of view, and this avoided the combination problem by denying real combination, by making each monad fundamentally separate, by explaining apparent interaction through pre-established harmony rather than causal connection. But this solution seems even more mysterious than the problem, seems to multiply entities and mechanisms beyond necessity, seems to replace one hard problem with many harder problems, and few contemporary panpsychists follow Leibniz down this path. Few are willing to accept the metaphysical extravagance his system requires. Strawson argues for panpsychism on the grounds that emergence is impossible, that you cannot get something from nothing, that if consciousness exists in the world, then it must have been present in the fundamental constituents of the world, must have been there from the beginning, because otherwise its appearance would be unintelligible, would be brute, would be the kind of emergence that violates the principle that effects must be contained somehow in their causes. And this argument has force, has intuitive appeal, captures the sense that consciousness is too radically different from non-conscious matter to emerge from it. But critics respond that emergence is ubiquitous in nature, that liquidity emerges from molecules that are not liquid, that life emerges from chemistry that is not alive, that many properties of wholes are not properties of parts. And if these emergences are possible, then why not consciousness? Why should consciousness be special? Why should it require fundamentality when other high-level properties do not? And Strawson's response is that consciousness is categorically different, that it is the only thing we know from the inside, that its emergence would not be like the emergence of liquidity, but like the emergence of existence itself. And this cannot emerge because emergence presupposes existence, and consciousness is a kind of existence, is the only kind we directly know, and so it must be fundamental. Tornoni's integrated information theory is sometimes interpreted as supporting panpsychism, because it says that consciousness is identical to integrated information, that any system with sufficient integration of information is conscious to some degree, and this would mean thermostats and atoms, and even individual electrons have tiny amounts of consciousness, have experience proportional to their integrated information, and this seems to support panpsychism, seems to make consciousness ubiquitous, but Tornoni himself resists the panpsychist interpretation, argues that most simple systems have essentially zero integrated information, that consciousness requires a specific kind of information integration that only complex systems like brains achieve. And the debate about whether IIT supports panpsychism turns on technical questions about how to measure integration, about what counts as information, about whether the theory is giving metaphysics or just correlation. And these questions remain unsettled, remain contested, remain another place where intuition and formalism diverge. The idea of proto-consciousness tries to soften panpsychism, tries to make it more palatable by saying that fundamental particles do not have full consciousness, but have some precursor of consciousness, some primitive form of experience that is to full consciousness, as charges to electromagnetism, a property that can give rise to consciousness without being consciousness itself. But this move seems to undermine the whole point of panpsychism, seems to reintroduce the emergence problem at a different level, because now we need to explain how proto-consciousness becomes consciousness, how the primitive forms combine and develop into the rich experiential life of humans. And this is just the hard problem again, just the explanatory gap relocated. And if proto-consciousness can do this, then why cannot non-consciousness do it? Why is proto-consciousness needed at all? And the answer seems to be that proto-consciousness makes emergence less mysterious, makes the gap smaller, but critics argue it just replaces one mystery with two: the mystery of consciousness and the mystery of proto-consciousness, and we are no better off than we started. James believed in a kind of panpsychism, believed in a pluralistic universe of experiences that combined and separated in various ways, believed that consciousness was not confined to brains, but was present wherever there was activity, wherever there was process, wherever there was something happening. And this fit his pragmatist philosophy, his rejection of rigid categories, his emphasis on process and relation over substance. But he never worked out the details, never solved the combination problem, never explained how his mind dust could aggregate into the unified streams of consciousness that characterize human experience. And his view remains more suggestive than systematic, more a gesture toward possibility than a worked-out theory. Whitehead developed an elaborate process philosophy where experience was fundamental, where actual occasions were drops of experience, where reality was constituted by moments of subjective feeling that perished and were superseded by new moments. And this was panpsychist in spirit. Though Whitehead resisted the label, and his system influenced many later philosophers, influenced process theology and ecological philosophy, and anyone who found substance metaphysics inadequate. But it also suffered from obscurity, from technical terminology that made it inaccessible, from a Baroque complexity that seemed disproportionate to the problems. It's solved, and while Whitehead's insights about process and relation and creativity remain valuable, his full system has few adherents, and his approach to consciousness has not solved the hard problem in ways that convince skeptics. The objection that panpsychism makes consciousness too cheap, too ubiquitous, too divorced from its connection to intelligence and behavior and biological function is answered by panpsychists who distinguish between consciousness and the various functional roles consciousness plays in humans, between bare experience and the kind of sophisticated, self-reflective awareness that humans have, and they argue that simple systems can have simple experiences without having thoughts or beliefs or desires or any of the cognitive machinery that humans possess, that consciousness comes in degrees, that there is a spectrum from the minimal experience of an electron to the rich inner life of a human, and this avoids making rocks intelligent while still allowing them some form of experience, but it also makes the view less testable, less empirical, less connected to anything we can observe or measure, because if consciousness is present everywhere, but only manifests in behavior in complex systems, then how do we know it is there in simple systems? How do we distinguish panpsychism from the claim that it is as if simple systems had experience, even though they do not? And this is the problem of panpsychist metaphysics. It makes claims that seem empirically empty, that make no difference to what we observe, that cannot be confirmed or disconfirmed by evidence, and this makes many scientists dismiss the view as unscientific, as metaphysical speculation disconnected from empirical inquiry. Yet panpsychism refuses to die, keeps returning, keeps attracting new defenders, and this persistence suggests it is responding to something real, some genuine difficulty in explaining consciousness within a purely mechanistic framework, some intuition that consciousness is too fundamental, too irreducible, too different from everything else, to be just another emergent property like liquidity or temperature. And whether this intuition is trustworthy or misleading, whether it points toward truth or just reflects the limits of human imagination, remains one of the deepest, unresolved questions in philosophy of mind and panpsychism. Despite its problems, despite the combination problem and the boundary problem and all the other difficulties, remains a live option, remains a view that serious philosophers take seriously, remains a possibility that cannot be ruled out by current evidence or argument, and this says something about the state of consciousness studies, about how far we are from understanding what consciousness is, how it arises, why it exists, and whether we will ever have answers that satisfy both our scientific standards and our philosophical intuitions about what makes an explanation adequate. History is told as a story of improvement, of movement from darkness toward light, from ignorance toward knowledge, from savagery toward civilization. And this story is so deeply embedded in modern consciousness that questioning it feels like madness, feels like denying the obvious, like rejecting the evidence that surrounds us in the form of technology, medicine, institutions, all the apparatus that makes contemporary life safer, longer, more comfortable than life in previous centuries. But the story is a story, is a narrative constructed retrospectively, is an interpretation imposed on events that could be read differently, could be organized into different patterns, could reveal trajectories other than progress. And the other trajectories are visible once the mythology is recognized as mythology. Once the belief in linear improvement is seen as belief rather than fact, as framework rather than discovery, as one way of organizing time among many possible ways, and the ways that are not chosen are the ones where time is cyclical, where history repeats, where civilizations rise and fall in patterns that suggest not progress, but oscillation, not improvement, but alternation between order and chaos, between flourishing and collapse. And collapse is what the mythology of progress cannot acknowledge, cannot incorporate, cannot make sense of, except as temporary setback, as aberration, as the exception that proves the rule. But what if collapse is not the exception but the rule, is not the deviation but the pattern, is what happens to every complex system eventually, inevitably, necessarily, because complexity is fragile, is requiring constant energy to maintain. And when the energy fails, when the resources are exhausted, when the conditions that allowed the complexity to emerge are no longer present, the system simplifies, degrades, collapses back into disorder. And this is not failure, but thermodynamics, is not moral failing, but physical law, is entropy doing what entropy does. And entropy is not progress, is not moving toward anything, is not improving but is equalizing, is smoothing out gradients, is converting order into disorder, structure into randomness. And life civilization, all the complexity that humans value, is temporary resistance to this process, is local pockets of order maintained at the cost of increasing disorder elsewhere. And the elsewhere is growing, is expanding, is eventually consuming the local, because the second law is inexorable, is not suspended by hope or effort or belief in progress. And so, the mythology of progress is fighting against physics, is claiming that the arrow of time points toward improvement, when really it points toward heat death, toward the end of difference, the end of structure, the end of everything that makes progress possible. And the possible is temporary, is the brief window during which complexity can exist, can build, can imagine itself to be moving forward, when really it is just moving, is just changing, is just reconfiguring before the inevitable simplification. And the simplification is what history shows when the mythology is removed, when the narrative of progress is recognized as narrative, as story, as interpretation, because what history actually shows is cycles, is empires rising and falling, is knowledge being gained and lost, is technologies being invented and forgotten, is civilizations reaching heights and then collapsing into darkness from which new civilizations emerge. And the emergence is not progress, is not improvement, is just the cycle continuing, is the pattern repeating, is order arising from chaos and returning to chaos in the rhythm that characterizes complex systems. And complex systems are not stable, are not sustainable, are not moving toward equilibrium, but are far from equilibrium, are maintained by constant input of energy. And when the input falters, the system collapses. And the collapse is not pathological, is not avoidable, is built into the structure, is the natural end of complexity. And the end comes for every civilization, has come for every civilization, will come for this civilization, because the conditions that allow it to exist are temporary, are contingent, are dependent on resources that are finite, on stability that is fragile, on assumptions that are false. And the false assumptions include the mythology of progress, include the belief that things are getting better, that humanity is moving forward, that the future will be superior to the past, and the superiority is measured in terms that already assume progress, is using metrics like lifespan and GDP and technological capacity. And these metrics show increase, show growth, show what looks like improvement, but improvement toward what? Toward what end? Toward what purpose? And the purpose is assumed, is not questioned, is taken as obvious, as self-evident, that more is better, that longer is better, that faster is better. But these are values, are choices, are not facts, are not discoveries, are impositions of meaning onto patterns that have no inherent meaning, and the meaning could be otherwise, could value stability over growth, could value harmony over domination, could value cyclical return over linear advance, and the advance is the mythology, is the story that the Enlightenment told, is the narrative that science and reason and individual liberty would lead to continuous improvement, to the perfectibility of human nature, to the triumph over suffering, over ignorance, over all the limitations that had constrained previous generations. And the triumph has not arrived, has not materialized, because the limitations were not overcome, but were transformed, were replaced by new limitations, new forms of suffering, new kinds of ignorance, and the new is not better than the old, is just different, is just the current configuration of problems that arise from the current configuration of solutions. Because every solution creates new problems, every technology introduces new vulnerabilities, every increase in power produces new risks, and the risks accumulate, compound, create the conditions for collapse, for the failure of the systems that have become too complex, too interconnected, too dependent on conditions remaining stable. And stability is the exception, is the temporary state, is what complex systems move away from rather than toward. Because complexity is dynamic, is changing, is adapting to pressures, and the adaptation is not progress but is response, is the system trying to maintain itself in the face of entropy, in the face of breakdown, in the face of the inevitable simplification. And the simplification is collapse, is the return to less complex states, is what happens when the energy required to maintain complexity exceeds the energy available, and the available is declining, is becoming scarce, is the resource base that allowed industrial civilization to emerge and that is now depleting, is now running out, is now revealing that the progress was not sustainable, was not based on infinite resources, but on finite stores that are being exhausted. And the exhaustion is the end of the mythology, is the revelation that progress was extraction, was the conversion of ancient sunlight into temporary complexity, into the structures that seem permanent, but are actually contingent, are actually dependent on inputs that are ending. And the ending is not failure, but is thermodynamics, is physics, is the way things work. And the way things work does not care about progress, does not care about human narratives, does not care about the stories that civilizations tell themselves to make sense of their existence. And the stories are necessary, are functional, are what allow coordination, are what create meaning, but they are not true, are not describing reality, are describing a constructed reality, a narrative reality, a reality that exists only in the collective imagination and that can be maintained only as long as the collective continues to believe. And the believing is becoming difficult, is becoming strained, because the evidence is mounting that progress has stalled, that the improvements have stopped, that the future is not going to be better than the present, might be worse, might be collapse, might be the simplification that has come for every other civilization and is now coming for this one. And the coming is not apocalypse, is not the end of everything, is just the end of this particular configuration, this particular arrangement of complexity. And what follows is not nothing but is different, is simpler, is less organized, less centralized, less dependent on the global systems that are currently failing, currently fragmenting, currently revealing their fragility. And the fragility was always there, was always the condition of complexity, was always the cost of building systems that are far from equilibrium, that require constant energy to maintain. And the energy is failing, is becoming unreliable, is exposing the mythology of progress as mythology, as story, as belief. That was never fact, was never discovery, was always interpretation, always narrative, always the imposition of meaning onto patterns that could mean anything, that could be organized into any story, and the story that is told shapes the response, shapes what is seen as problem and what is seen as solution, shapes whether collapse is recognized as collapse or is interpreted as temporary setback, as challenge to be overcome, as opportunity for innovation. And innovation is the god of. Progress is the answer to every problem, is the belief that human ingenuity can overcome any limitation, can solve any crisis, can extend the trajectory of improvement indefinitely. And the indefinitely is the lie, is the impossibility, is the claim that entropy can be defeated, that complexity can be maintained forever, that the conditions that allowed progress are permanent when they are temporary, are contingent, are ending. And the ending is visible in the stagnation of median incomes, in the declining returns on technology, in the increasing fragility of supply chains, in the breakdown of institutions, in the resurgence of tribalism, in all the signs that the centre is not holding, that the complexity is too much, that the system is simplifying, whether it wants to or not. And the not wanting is the clinging to the mythology, is the insistence that progress must continue, that the future must be better, that collapse is not possible, not thinkable, not allowable, but the allowable is not up to humans, is not subject to preference, is determined by physics, by resources, by the limits that cannot be overcome through belief or effort or innovation. And the limits are asserting themselves, are becoming visible, are revealing that the mythology of progress was always just that, was always story, was always the narrative that a particular civilization told itself during its particular window of complexity. And the window is closing, is narrowing, is approaching the point where the story can no longer be maintained, where the evidence of stagnation and decline becomes overwhelming, becomes undeniable, becomes the new reality that requires a new story, a new mythology, and the new mythology is not yet formed, is not yet coherent, is emerging in fragments, in the recognition that growth cannot continue, that resources are finite, that complexity is fragile, that collapse is not aberration, but pattern, not failure but phase, not the end but the transition. And the transition is what humans are bad at, are resisting, are denying, because the mythology of progress makes transition look like regression, makes simplification look like failure, makes collapse look like catastrophe, when it is just change, is just the system moving to a different state, a less complex state, a state that requires less energy, less resources, less organization. And the less is not worse, is not better, is just different, is the configuration that is possible given the conditions, and the conditions are changing, are no longer supporting the complexity, are no longer providing the energy, are no longer maintaining the stability. And so the system is responding, is adapting, is simplifying, and the simplifying is collapse, is the end of the mythology, is the revelation that progress was never linear, was never guaranteed, was never more than a temporary pattern that emerged under specific conditions, and that is now ending as those conditions change. And the changing is not stoppable, is not reversible, is the natural progression of complex systems, is what happens when entropy reasserts itself, when the local order that was maintained at great cost can no longer be maintained, and what remains is disorder, is simplicity, is the lower energy state that does not require the constant input, the constant effort, the constant belief in progress, that was never more than belief, was never fact, was never discovery, was always mythology, and mythologies end, are always ending, are replaced by new mythologies that make sense of the new conditions, and the new conditions are simplification, are localization, are the breakdown of the global systems that defined progress, that made progress visible, that created the metrics by which improvement was measured, and the measuring is ending, is becoming irrelevant, because the systems that supported the measuring are fragmenting, are collapsing, are revealing that they were never as solid as they seemed, were always contingent, always temporary, always dependent on conditions that are now changing, and the changing is what humans must adapt to, must respond to, must accept, because the accepting is what allows response, what allows adaptation, what makes survival possible. And survival is not progress, is not improvement, is just continuation, is just the persistence of life in new forms, in simpler forms, in forms that do not require the mythology of progress, that do not assume the future will be better, that do not measure themselves against an imagined trajectory of improvement. And the imagined was always the problem, was always the mythology, was the story that made sense when complexity was increasing, when energy was abundant, when resources seemed infinite, but none of those conditions hold. Anymore, none of those assumptions are valid. And so the mythology is crumbling, is being revealed as mythology. And what is being revealed is not that progress was false, but that it was conditional, was temporary, was the pattern of a particular phase, and the phase is ending, is giving way to a different phase, a phase of simplification, of localization, of the breakdown, of complexity. And the breakdown is not the end, but is transition, is the movement from one state to another, from high complexity to lower complexity, from global systems to local systems, from the mythology of progress to something else, to some other story, some other way of making sense of time, of organizing history, of understanding change. And the understanding is what is needed, is what allows the transition to be navigated, allows collapse to be survived, allows the species to persist beyond the mythology, beyond the belief in progress, into a future that is not better or worse but different, is not moving forward or backward, but is just moving, is just changing, is just the continuation of patterns that have always characterized life, that have always characterized civilizations, that have always involved cycles of increase and decrease, of complexity and simplification, of rise and fall. And the fall is not tragedy, is not failure, is just the other half of the cycle, is the return that follows every advance, is the simplification that follows every increase in complexity, is the natural, inevitable, thermodynamically necessary end of every period of growth. And growth cannot be infinite, cannot continue forever, must end, must reverse, must give way to simplification. And the simplification is happening, is visible, is undeniable once the mythology is set aside, once the belief in progress is recognized as belief, as story, as narrative that served a purpose but is no longer serving that purpose, is no longer making sense of the present, is no longer predicting the future, is no longer functioning as mythology should function. And so it is being abandoned, is being replaced, is giving way to new stories, new frameworks, new ways of understanding time. And the new ways are not yet clear, are not yet coherent, are emerging in the recognition that progress was always mythology, that linear time was always story, that improvement was always interpretation, and that the patterns of history are not linear but cyclical, not progressive but oscillating, not moving toward anything but just moving, just changing, just expressing the dynamics of complex systems that arise and fall, that order and disorder, that complexify and simplify in rhythms that have nothing to do with progress, nothing to do with improvement, nothing to do with the narratives that humans tell, but are just the way things work, the way systems behave, the way entropy plays out in the temporary pockets of order that are life, that are civilization, that are all the complexity that seems permanent but is actually fleeting, actually momentary, actually the brief resistance to the overwhelming tendency toward disorder. And the disorder is not evil, is not failure, is not the end of meaning, is just the default state, the equilibrium, the simplicity that complex systems return to. And the return is not tragedy, but is nature, is physics, is the way things are. And accepting this, accepting that progress was mythology, that collapse is natural, that the future is not moving forward, but is just moving, is what allows the transition, allows the adaptation, allows the species to survive beyond the mythology, beyond the belief that made sense for a while, but makes sense no longer. And the no longer is now, is the present, is the moment when the mythology is crumbling, is being revealed as story, and the story is ending. Not because it was false, but because it was conditional, was applicable only under certain conditions, and the conditions have changed, are changing, are no longer supporting the narrative, are no longer making progress visible, are no longer sustaining the belief, and so the belief is fading, is being replaced by something else, by the recognition that time is not linear, that history is not progressive, that the future is not determined by the past in any simple way, that complexity and simplicity alternate, that rise and fall are phases of the same cycle. And the cycle is what matters, is what persists, is what continues beyond any particular civilization. beyond any particular mythology, beyond any particular belief about where time is going or what the future holds. Because the future holds nothing except change, holds nothing except the continuation of patterns that have always operated, that operate now, that will continue to operate regardless of what humans believe, regardless of what stories they tell, regardless of the mythologies they construct to make sense of their existence. And the existence continues, adapts, persists, not through progress but through change, not through improvement but through transformation, not through moving forward but through moving, just changing, just being what systems are, which is dynamic, unstable, temporary, and always, eventually, inevitably, returning to simplicity, returning to disorder, returning to the state from which complexity briefly emerged and to which it always returns. And the return is not the end, but is the pattern, is the cycle, is the way things work. And working with this, accepting this, understanding this, is what allows humans to move beyond the mythology of progress, beyond the belief in linear time, beyond the narrative of improvement, into a relationship with time that is more honest, more realistic, more aligned with the actual patterns of history. And the actual patterns are not progressive, but are cyclical, are not moving forward but are oscillating, are not improving but are changing. And the changing is all there is all there ever was, is all there ever will be. And the will be is not better, is not worse, is just different, is just the future, is just what comes next. And what comes next is not determined by mythology, is not shaped by belief in progress, is not the continuation of improvement, but is the continuation of patterns, of cycles, of the rise and fall that has always characterized complexity, that has always characterized civilization, that is now revealing itself again, is now becoming visible again, is now showing that progress was always temporary, was always conditional, was always mythology, and mythology's end, must end, are ending now. And what comes after is not nothing but is different. Is the next story, the next framework, the next way of making sense of time, and the sense that is made will not include progress, will not assume improvement, will not project linear advance, but will recognize cycles, will accept collapse, will understand that complexity and simplicity alternate, that neither is permanent, that both are phases, and that the phase of progress, the phase of increasing complexity, the phase of the mythology is ending, is giving way to simplification, to collapse, to the next phase of the cycle. And the next phase is not tragedy, is not the end, is just different, is just what comes after growth, is just the return to lower complexity. And the return is natural, is inevitable, is happening now. And recognizing this, accepting this, understanding this is what allows the transition, what allows the adaptation, what makes survival possible beyond the mythology, beyond the belief in progress, beyond the narrative that time moves forward. Because time does not move forward, time just moves, just changes, just continues. And the continuing is not progress, but is just continuation, is just the persistence of patterns, of cycles, of the dynamics that have always operated and will always operate, regardless of what humans believe, regardless of the mythologies they construct, regardless of the stories they tell themselves, to make the chaos bearable. And the chaos is bearable, has always been bearable, is just change, is just the way things are. And the way things are does not include progress, does not include improvement, does not include the mythology, includes only change, only cycles, only the oscillation between complexity and simplicity, between order and disorder, between the rise that seems like progress and the fall that reveals. It was always just phase, just pattern, just the temporary resistance to entropy that all complex systems represent. And the representation is ending, is collapsing, is returning to simplicity. And the simplicity is not the end, but is the beginning, is the ground from which new complexity might emerge, might rise, might begin a new cycle. And the new cycle will not be progress, but will just be cycle, will just be pattern, will just be the continuation of dynamics that do not care about human narratives, do not respond to human beliefs, do not acknowledge the mythology of progress, except as one more temporary pattern that emerged and fell, that rose and collapsed, that was and is no longer, and the no longer is now. The eye cannot see itself without a mirror, and even then what appears in the reflection is reversed, backward, fundamentally altered by the act of observation. And this simple fact about vision contains within it a deeper truth about consciousness, about the strange recursive loop that happens when awareness tries to become aware of itself, when the mind attempts to know the mind, when the self turns inward to discover what the self actually is, and what it finds or thinks it finds is never quite the thing doing the finding, never quite the observer, but always the observed, always one step removed, always a representation rather than the thing itself. And this gap, this irreducible distance between the knower and the known, when both are supposedly the same entity, creates a problem that has troubled philosophers since humans first developed the capacity to ask who they are, a problem that might not have a solution because the very structure of self-knowledge contains a contradiction, a paradox built into the architecture of introspection that makes genuine self-understanding not just difficult, but perhaps logically impossible. The ancient Greeks carved into the temple at Delphi the command to know thyself, and Socrates spent his life insisting that the unexamined life is not worth living, that self-knowledge is the foundation of wisdom, the beginning of philosophy, the path to virtue. But Socrates also claimed to know nothing, claimed that his only wisdom was recognizing his ignorance, and perhaps these two positions are connected. Perhaps the examination of the self leads inevitably to the discovery that the self cannot be known, that the more carefully one looks inward, the more elusive the thing being sought becomes, like trying to grasp water or catch one's own shadow. And this elusiveness is not an accident, not a failure of attention or effort, but something essential to what consciousness is, something about how the mind works that makes it constitutively opaque to itself, forever mysterious, forever strange. When someone sits quietly and tries to observe their own thoughts, tries to watch the mind in action, something peculiar happens. The thoughts change. They become different thoughts, self-conscious thoughts, thoughts about thinking, and the original spontaneous flow of mental activity that was supposed to be observed has already been altered by the act of observation, has been replaced by a different kind of mental activity, the activity of observing. And this is the observer effect in consciousness, borrowed from quantum physics, where the act of measurement changes what is being measured, where particles behave differently when watched. And though the analogy is imperfect, though consciousness is not exactly like quantum systems, there is something similar happening, something about awareness that transforms its object, that cannot leave things as they are. And this means that introspection is never neutral, never a clear window onto the mind, but always an intervention, always a distortion. And what is seen in introspection is not the mind as it normally operates, but the mind as it operates when being observed, which is a different mind, a mind in a different state, performing a different function. The psychologist Timothy Wilson calls this the introspection illusion, the false belief that people have direct access to their mental processes, that they can simply look inward and discover why they feel what they feel, why they believe what they believe, why they did what they did. But decades of research in cognitive psychology show that introspection is unreliable, that people confidently report reasons for their behavior that are simply wrong, that they confabulate explanations without realizing they are confabulating, that the mind generates plausible sounding stories about itself, but these stories are not reports from the inside, are not transcripts of actual mental processes, but rather are post hoc rationalizations. narratives constructed after the fact to make sense of actions that were caused by processes the conscious mind never had access to in the first place. In one famous experiment, researchers showed people photographs and asked them to choose which face they found more attractive. And after the choice was made, the researchers used sleight of hand to swap the photographs, showing people the face they did not choose and asking them to explain why they chose it. And the majority of people did not notice the switch, did not realize they were explaining a choice they never made, and they generated detailed explanations, talked about the eyes, the smile, the overall impression, completely convinced they were reporting genuine introspective insights, when in fact they were making up reasons, on the spot, confabulating freely. And this was not lying, was not intentional deception, because the people genuinely believed their own explanations, genuinely felt they were accurately describing their mental processes. But they were not, they were creating a story. And this is what introspection often is, not discovery, but creation, not observation, but fabrication. And the frightening part is that it feels identical from the inside. There is no phenomenological difference between genuine self-knowledge and convincing self-deception. No way to tell, just by introspecting, whether the reasons being accessed are real or invented, whether the self-understanding being achieved is accurate or illusory. The philosopher Gilbert Ryle argued against what he called the ghost in the machine, against the Cartesian idea that there is an inner mental theatre where a homunculus, a little person inside the head, watches experiences unfold on a screen. And Ryle pointed out that this model leads to infinite regress, because if there is a homunculus watching the screen, then what is watching the homunculus? What is aware of the awareness? And this question repeats indefinitely, creating an infinite stack of observers, which is absurd, which suggests the model is wrong, that consciousness is not structured like a theatre with an audience, that there is no central viewing point, no little self inside observing the big self. But if this is true, if there is no homunculus, then what is introspection? What is happening when it feels like the self is observing itself? And the answer might be that nothing is being observed, that introspection is a kind of cognitive illusion, a trick the brain plays, a way of accessing some information about its own states, but mistaking this limited, partial access for complete transparency, for total self-knowledge, when really most of what the brain does is hidden, is unconscious, is inaccessible to the part that thinks it is doing the knowing. Freud built an entire therapeutic method on the premise that the self is largely unknown to itself, that beneath the conscious mind lies the unconscious, vast and dark and full of repressed desires, traumatic memories, primitive drives, and that the work of psychoanalysis is to make the unconscious conscious, to bring into awareness what has been hidden, to achieve insight. And for Freud, insight was curative. Knowing why you're anxious or depressed or behaving strangely would dissolve the symptom, would free you from the tyranny of forces you did not understand. But the history of psychoanalysis is also a history of people discovering things about themselves that they do not recognize, that feel foreign, that seem like they must belong to someone else. And the analyst says, "This is you. This desire, this rage, this fear." And the patient says, "No, that is not me. I do not feel that way." And the analyst says, "You are resisting. You are defending against the truth." And maybe the analyst is right. Maybe resistance is real. But maybe also the patient is right. Maybe what the analyst is finding through interpretation is not the hidden self, but another construct, another story, not more true than the patient's own story, just differently structured. And the question becomes, whose interpretation counts as knowledge? Who gets to say what the self really is when the self being analysed does not recognise itself in the analysis? Carl Rogers, the humanistic psychologist, took a different approach, argued that the therapist should not interpret, should not claim to know the client better than the client knows themselves, but should rather create conditions where the client can explore their own experience, can come to their own understanding, And Rogers believed that people have an innate capacity for self-awareness, that given the right environment of empathy and unconditional, positive regard, the true self would emerge. But even Rogers noticed something strange. Noticed that people in therapy often encountered aspects of themselves that surprised them, that contradicted their self-concept, that felt like meeting a stranger. And sometimes this stranger was more real than the familiar self. Sometimes the person they thought they were turned out to be a performance, a mask, a role they had been playing for so long they forgot it was a role. And the therapeutic process was not discovering the self, but discovering that the self they thought they knew was a fiction. And underneath that fiction was not another, more authentic self, but just more layers, more complexity, more contradictions that resist integration into a single, coherent narrative. The philosopher Paul Ricoeur wrote about the hermeneutics of suspicion, about thinkers like Marx and Nietzsche and Freud, who taught that consciousness is false consciousness, that what people believe about themselves is ideology or rationalization or symptom, that the surface meaning is never the real meaning, that everything must be interpreted, decoded, suspected, and Ricoeur saw this as both necessary and dangerous. Necessary because people do deceive themselves, do operate under illusions, but dangerous because it leads to a paranoid style of thinking where nothing is taken at face value, where every claim to self-knowledge is dismissed as naive, where the expert, the analyst, the critical theorist always knows better than the person living the life. And this dynamic is a power dynamic, is a way of invalidating someone's experience, of saying, you do not know yourself, but I know you. And Ricoeur tried to balance the hermeneutics of suspicion with a hermeneutics of trust, tried to preserve the possibility that people sometimes do know themselves, that introspection sometimes does reveal genuine truths. But even he could not escape the problem that the self who is trusting their own introspection might be the one most deceived, might be the one who needs suspicion the most. And so the circle closes. The paradox remains. How to know whether you know yourself when the instrument of knowing is the same instrument being examined, when the eye trying to see itself has no independent vantage point, no place to stand outside the system. Neuroscience has added new dimensions to this problem, has shown that the brain is not a unified system, but a collection of subsystems, modules, networks that often operate independently, sometimes in conflict, and that what is experienced as the self, as the unified conscious agent, is really a construct, an emergent property, a story the brain tells about the activity of its parts. And this story is useful, helps coordinate behavior, helps navigate social environments, but it is not an accurate map of the underlying territory, not a faithful representation of how the brain actually works. And the neuroscientist Michael Gazzaniga studied split-brain patients, people whose corpus callosum, the bundle of nerves connecting the two hemispheres, had been severed to treat epilepsy. And in these patients, the two hemispheres can be shown different information, can be asked to perform different tasks. And what Gazzaniga found is that the left hemisphere, the one responsible for language, will confabulate explanations for actions initiated by the right hemisphere, will create stories to explain behavior it did not cause and does not understand. And the patient is not aware of confabulating, genuinely believes the explanations, and Gazzaniga calls the left hemisphere the interpreter, argues that one of its primary functions is to generate a coherent narrative of the self, to make sense of the chaos of neural activity, to create the illusion of unity and purpose and understanding. And if the left hemisphere does this in split-brain patients, it is likely doing it in everyone, all the time, constantly interpreting, constantly explaining, constantly constructing a self that feels real but might be mostly fiction. The Buddhist tradition has long taught that the self is an illusion, that what is called the self is really just a collection of aggregates, body and sensations, and perceptions and mental formations and consciousness. And these aggregates are constantly changing, never stable, never autonomous, always conditioned by causes beyond their control. And the belief in a permanent, independent self is the root of suffering, is what causes attachment and aversion. And the path to liberation is to see through this illusion, to experience directly the absence of self, the emptiness. And this teaching is not theoretical, but experiential, is something that advanced meditators report encountering: the dissolution of the sense of self, the realization that there is no one home, no center, no observer, just experience arising and passing. And Western scientists studying meditation have found that certain practices do alter brain activity in regions associated with self-reference, do reduce the default mode network that activates when people are thinking about themselves. And some meditators describe this as liberating, as a relief, as finally seeing clearly, but others find it terrifying, find that the loss of self feels like annihilation, like death. And the question is whether what the meditators are discovering is the truth about the self, or just another state of consciousness, just a different way of experiencing, and whether there is any way to know which interpretation is correct, whether the self that feels so solid in ordinary consciousness is the illusion, or whether the no self experienced in deep meditation is the illusion, or whether both are valid descriptions of different aspects of the same underlying reality that cannot be captured completely by either framework. David Hume in the 18th century tried to find the self through introspection, tried to locate the I that supposedly unifies experience, and he reported that he could never find it, that when he looked inward, all he found were particular perceptions, particular thoughts and feelings and sensations, but never the self that was supposedly having these perceptions, never the subject separate from the objects of consciousness. And Hume concluded that the self is a fiction, a bundle of perceptions held together by memory and causation, but not by any underlying substance. And this conclusion disturbed him. He admitted that his skepticism about the self led to a kind of philosophical melancholy, a sense of being lost in a labyrinth with no exit. But even as he doubted the existence of the self, he continued to use the first person, continued to say, I think, I feel, I conclude. And this tension, this inability to live, according to the implications of the philosophy, shows how deeply the sense of self is embedded, how resistant it is to intellectual dissolution. And perhaps this is because the self is not a thing to be found through introspection, but a process, a doing rather than a being, the activity of organizing experience rather than an entity that exists independently of that activity. And if this is true, then looking for the self is like trying to find the dance apart from the dancing, trying to locate the song separate from the singing, and the failure to find it does not prove. It does not exist, but rather proves that the question is malformed, that existence is the wrong category, that the self is not the kind of thing that can be observed because it is the observing, not the object, but the act. And this shift in framing does not solve the problem, but relocates it, makes the question not whether the self exists, but what kind of thing it is, what kind of existence it has, and whether this kind of existence is compatible with self-knowledge, or whether self-knowledge in the traditional sense, knowledge of an object by a subject, is structurally impossible when subject and object are the same. Philosophers sometimes distinguish between phenomenal consciousness, the what it is likeness of experience, and access consciousness, the information available for use in reasoning and report, and they note that these can come apart, that there might be experiences that feel like something but cannot be accessed, cannot be reported, cannot be known by the person having them. And this suggests that consciousness is not transparent to itself, that there are aspects of subjective experience that are hidden even from the subject. And if this is true, then the project of self-knowledge faces an even deeper obstacle. Not just the problem of the observer effect or confabulation, but the problem that some of what the self is, some of what makes experience what it is in principle inaccessible, is locked away in a part of consciousness that has no connection to the part that can reflect and report. And this inaccessible region might be small, or it might be vast, might be a minor footnote to consciousness, or might be the bulk of it. And there is no way to know, because by definition, it cannot be known, cannot be brought into awareness. And so, self-knowledge, even in the best case, is always partial, always incomplete, always missing something essential that remains forever in darkness. The question then becomes not whether complete self-knowledge is possible, because it is not, but whether partial self-knowledge is worth pursuing, whether the fragments of understanding that can be achieved through introspection and therapy and meditation and neuroscience are valuable, even if they are fragments, even if they do not add up to a complete picture. And the answer might be yes, might be that partial knowledge is better than none, that understanding some of the forces shaping thought and behavior is better than understanding nothing, that the attempt to know the self, even if it cannot fully succeed, makes life more deliberate, more examined, more awake. And this is what Socrates might have meant. Not that self-knowledge is achievable, but that the examination is valuable, that the questioning itself, the refusal to accept the surface, the insistence on looking deeper, even when the depths remain murky, is what distinguishes a life worth living from a life lived in automaticity, in habit, in the sleep of unexamined assumption. And perhaps the paradox of self-knowledge is not a problem to be solved, but a tension to be inhabited, a recognition that the self is always both knower and unknown, always both transparent and opaque, always both intimate and strange, and that this dual nature is not a bug but a feature, not a limitation, but the condition of being the kind of creature that can ask who it is, that can turn awareness back on itself even if the turn is never complete, even if the circle never closes, even if the eye can never fully see itself and must remain forever partially blind to its own nature. The suffering is not in having little, but in having less, not in lacking, but in being surpassed, not in absence, but in comparison. And comparison is constant, is unavoidable, is built into perception, into cognition, into the social architecture of human life. Because humans are not isolated processes of absolute value, but are deeply embedded in networks where worth is relative, where position matters more than possession, where status is the thing being tracked, being measured, being fought over, and the fighting is exhausting, is endless, is producing anxiety that has no clear source except the presence of others, the visibility of their achievements, their possessions, their apparent happiness. And the apparent is what matters, is what comparison operates on. Because comparison does not have access to internal states, cannot measure actual satisfaction or genuine contentment, can only measure signals, displays, the external markers that are supposed to indicate success. And success is not absolute, is not a threshold that once crossed brings lasting peace, but is relative, is defined against the success of others, is meaningful only in context, only in relationship, only as position in a hierarchy that has no natural endpoints, no place where more is impossible, no level where comparison stops. And the stopping is what never happens, is what cannot happen, because there is always someone higher, always someone with more, always someone whose position makes one's own position feel insufficient, feel like failure, feel like falling behind. And behind is where comparison places everyone, except the very top, except the singular position that by definition only one can occupy. And even that position is temporary, is unstable, is vulnerable to being surpassed, to losing the lead, to falling back into the mass of strivers who are all measuring themselves against the same unreachable standard. And the unreachable is what drives the system, is what keeps everyone running, keeps everyone comparing, keeps everyone suffering from the gap between where they are and where they see others, where they imagine others, where the displays and signals suggest others have arrived, and the arrival is illusion, is performance, is the curated presentation that social media perfects, that makes comparison more toxic than ever before. Because the comparison is now constant, is now unavoidable, is now the default activity of any moment with a screen. And the screen shows the highlight reel, shows the best moments, the peak experiences, the carefully selected and filtered images that are meant to represent lives, but are really representing brands, representing the performance of success. And the performance is what gets compared against reality, against the unfiltered experience of one's own life, with all its ordinariness, all its mundane moments, all the time that is not photogenic, not shareable, not worth displaying. And the asymmetry creates distortion, creates the sense that everyone else is doing better, is happier, is more successful, is living the life that one should be living, but is not. And the not is experienced as personal failure, as inadequacy, as evidence that something is wrong with the self, when really what is wrong is the comparison, is the measuring of internal experience against external display, of reality against performance, of the whole of one's life against the curated fragments of others' lives. And the fragments are not representative, are not honest, are not revealing the struggles, the doubts, the failures that are also present but are edited out, are kept private, are not part of the display. And so the display creates impossible standards, creates the sense that success should be constant, that happiness should be visible, that worth should be demonstrable. And demonstrable means comparable, means measurable against others, means existing in the public space where position can be assessed, where rank can be assigned, where the hierarchy becomes visible. And the visibility is what social media provides, is what makes the panopticon complete, is what ensures that everyone is always being watched, always being measured, always being compared, not by a central authority, but by everyone else, by the distributed surveillance of the network, where every post is a signal, every image is a claim, every update is a statement of position, and the position is what matters, is what gets evaluated, is what determines worth in the social economy, where attention is currency and visibility is power, and power is zero-sum, is rivalrous, is gained by some at the expense of others, because attention is finite, is limited, is allocated according to comparison, according to who is most interesting, most successful, most worth watching. And the worth watching is what everyone is competing for, is what drives the performance, is what makes authenticity impossible. Because authenticity does not optimize for attention, does not maximize engagement, does not win the comparison, and winning is what the system demands, is what the architecture incentivizes, is what the algorithms reward, and the rewards go to those who perform best, who display most effectively, who signal status most clearly, and the clarity is achieved through excess, through conspicuous consumption, through the demonstration of resources, of connections, of experiences that others do not have. And the not having is what makes the display valuable, is what makes it worth envying, is what triggers the comparison that produces the anxiety that drives more performance, more display, more competition. And the competition is the prison, is the trap, is the system that has no exit, because exiting means becoming invisible, means losing position, means falling behind, and behind is unbearable, is the failure state, is where the losers are. And no one wants to be a loser, no one wants to be the one who is surpassed, who is left behind, who is forgotten. And the forgetting is what happens to those who stop performing, who stop displaying, who drop out of the comparison. And dropping out is not freedom but is erasure, is not peace but is irrelevance, is not escape but is defeat. And so most stay in, most keep performing, most keep comparing, most keep suffering from the gap between where they are and where they see others. and the seeing is continuous, is unavoidable, is the default state of consciousness. In an environment where everyone's position is visible, where everyone's success is displayed, where everyone's life is performance and the performance is what gets internalized, becomes the standard against which the self is measured. And the measuring is constant, is automatic, is happening at every moment, in every context, whenever others are present, or even when they are not present but are represented, are visible through screens, through feeds, through the endless stream of signals that constitute social media. And social media is the panopticon perfected, is the prison where everyone is guard and prisoner simultaneously, is watching and being watched, is judging and being judged, is comparing and being compared. And the comparing is the punishment, is the suffering, is the anxiety that has no clear cause except the presence of others, the visibility of their position, the evidence that they have what one does not have, and the not having is experienced as deprivation, as relative deprivation, as the sense that one is lacking not in absolute terms but in comparison to others, and the comparison is the only terms that matter, is the only measurement that counts. Because humans are social, are tribal, are wired to care about position, about rank, about where they stand in the hierarchy, and the hierarchy is not natural, is not fixed, is not based on any inherent quality, but is constructed through comparison, through the constant evaluation of signals, of displays, of the markers that are supposed to indicate worth. And worth is not intrinsic, is not internal, is not a property of the self, but is assigned, is determined by others, is the result of comparison, of measurement, of the social process that ranks everyone according to criteria that are arbitrary, that are culturally specific, that are manipulable. And the manipulation is what social media enables, is what allows anyone to perform success, to display status, to signal position regardless of underlying reality. And the reality is hidden, is private, is not part of the comparison. And so the comparison is always distorted, is always measuring performance against performance, display against display, rather than reality against reality. And the reality is that most people are struggling, are anxious, are feeling inadequate, are suffering from the same comparison that they are inflicting on others, and the inflicting is not intentional, is not malicious, is just participation, is just performing, is just displaying the signals that are required to maintain position, to avoid falling behind, to stay in the game. And the game is the prison, is the system that has no winners, because there is no endpoint, no level of success that brings peace, no amount of status that ends comparison, because comparison is relative, is always finding someone higher, always finding new metrics, always raising the bar, and the raising is what makes enough impossible, is what ensures that satisfaction is temporary, is what converts every achievement into baseline, into the new normal that is no longer impressive, no longer enviable, no longer worth displaying because everyone else has caught up, has matched the signal, has equaled the performance, and so new signals are needed, new displays are required, new forms of status must be pursued, and the pursuit is endless, is exhausting, is producing the anxiety that characterizes modern life, the sense that one is always falling behind, always insufficient, always failing to measure up. And the measuring up is the problem, is the trap, is the prison, because up is infinite, is unlimited, is always higher than wherever one currently is. And so the climbing never ends, never reaches a summit, never arrives at a place where comparison stops, where enough is recognized as enough, where peace is possible, and peace is not possible as long as comparison continues, as long as others are visible, as long as position matters, and position always matters, is wired into human psychology, is part of the social brain that evolved to track status, to monitor hierarchy, to care intensely about where one stands relative to others, and the relative is the only measure that counts, is the only information that the social brain processes, is why absolute improvements in living standards do not produce corresponding improvements in happiness. Because happiness is relative, is determined by comparison, is about position, not possession, and position is zero-sum, is gained by some at the expense of others, is the ranking that ensures most people feel inadequate most of the time. Because most people are not at the top, are not in the elite positions, are somewhere in the middle or the bottom, are below someone, are being surpassed by someone, are losing the comparison to someone, and the someone is always visible, is always present, is always there to trigger the anxiety, to produce the envy, to create the suffering that comes from measuring oneself against others and finding oneself lacking. And the lacking is not real, is not objective, is only relative, is only meaningful in comparison. But the comparison is what makes it feel real, what makes it feel like failure, what makes it feel like something is wrong, something needs to change, something must be improved. And the improvement is pursued, is worked toward, is achieved. And the achievement brings temporary satisfaction, brings a brief moment of feeling successful, of feeling adequate, of feeling like enough. But the enough is temporary, is quickly replaced by new comparison, by new awareness of those who are higher, who have more, who have surpassed. And the surpassing is the trigger, is what resets the baseline, is what converts achievement into inadequacy, is what makes the prison inescapable. Because escaping requires not just achieving more, but achieving more than everyone else. And everyone else is also striving, is also comparing, is also trying to escape through achievement. And so the competition intensifies, the standards rise, the bar keeps moving, and the moving is what makes peace impossible, makes satisfaction temporary, makes enough unattainable, because enough is not an absolute measure, but is relative, is defined by comparison, is determined by position, and position is always vulnerable, is always threatened, is always at risk of being lost. And the risk creates anxiety, creates vigilance, creates the constant monitoring of others, of their signals, of their displays, of any evidence that they're gaining, advancing, surpassing, and the surpassing is what must be prevented, is what drives the performance, is what makes rest impossible, makes dropping out unthinkable, makes the prison unescapable, except by those rare individuals who somehow break free of comparison, who somehow stop measuring themselves against others, who somehow find peace in their own position, regardless of where that position is in the hierarchy. And these individuals are rare, are exceptions, are not the norm, because the norm is comparison, is the constant measurement, is the anxiety that comes from always being aware of others, of their position, of their apparent success. And the apparent is what matters, is what the social brain responds to, is what triggers the envy. And envy is information, is the signal that someone else has something valuable, something worth having, something that could improve one's own position. And the position is what envy is tracking, is what it is designed to make salient, is the gap that needs closing, and the closing is pursued through imitation, through acquisition, through the striving to match what the envied other has, to equal their position, to eliminate the gap. But the gap never closes, is never eliminated, because as soon as one gap is closed, another opens. As soon as one person is matched, another surpasses. As soon as one goal is achieved, the goalposts move, and the moving is what makes the prison permanent, makes the suffering chronic, makes the anxiety inescapable, because the architecture of social comparison is not designed for peace, is not optimized for satisfaction, is designed for striving, for competition, for the endless pursuit of position. And the pursuit is the function, is what the system needs, is what makes the hierarchy dynamic, what keeps people climbing, what ensures that those at the top are always being challenged, always being pursued, always at risk of being overtaken. And the risk is what makes their position valuable, is what makes status worth having, is what creates the scarcity that makes position meaningful. And meaningful means enviable, means desirable, means worth suffering for. and the suffering is universal, is experienced at every level, is not limited to those at the bottom, but is felt even at the top. Because even at the top there is comparison. There is the awareness of others who are close, who are threatening, who might surpass, and the might creates anxiety, creates the need to defend position, to maintain distance, to keep performing, keep displaying, keep signalling status, and the signalling is exhausting, is requiring constant effort, constant vigilance, constant awareness of how one is being perceived, how one is being measured, how one's position is being evaluated by others who are always comparing, always measuring, always judging, and the judging is mutual, is reciprocal, is everyone evaluating everyone else, is the distributed surveillance that makes the panopticon total, that makes escape impossible, that ensures everyone is always in the prison, always being compared, always suffering from the awareness that others are watching, measuring, judging, and that the judgment might be negative, might find one lacking, might assign a lower position than one wants, than one deserves, than one has worked for. And the work is never enough, is never sufficient, is never achieving the permanent security that would allow rest, would allow peace, would allow the comparison to stop mattering. Because the comparison never stops mattering, is always relevant, is always the measure that counts, is what determines worth in the social economy, where position is everything, where rank is identity, where hierarchy is reality, and reality is constructed through comparison, through the constant measurement that assigns everyone a place, a position, a rank. And the rank is always provisional, always temporary, always vulnerable to change, to being surpassed, to falling, and the falling is what everyone fears, is what drives the anxiety, is what makes the prison work. Because the prison is not a place, but is a process, is the constant comparison that measures everyone against everyone else and finds everyone lacking, because lacking is relative, is inevitable, is the necessary result of a system where only one can be first, where most must be middle, where someone must be last and the last is where no one wants to be, is the position that is avoided, that is fled from, that creates the most anxiety, the most suffering, the most desperate striving to escape. And the escape is pursued through the same means that created the prison, through comparison, through performance, through display, through the signalling of status that is supposed to improve position, but only reinforces the system, only strengthens the prison, only ensures that comparison continues, that measurement persists, that the anxiety remains. And the remaining is permanent, is chronic, is the condition of social existence in an environment where everyone is visible, where position is trackable, where comparison is unavoidable. And the unavoidable is what makes the suffering universal, is what ensures that peace is rare, that satisfaction is temporary, that enough is never enough, because enough is not absolute but is relative, is determined by comparison, is defined by position, and position is always being measured, always being evaluated, always being compared, and the comparison is the prison, is the trap, is the source of suffering that has no solution except the impossible one of stopping comparison, of ceasing to measure oneself against others, of finding worth that is internal rather than relative, that is intrinsic rather than assigned, that is independent of position, independent of rank, independent of the hierarchy that comparison creates and maintains, and the maintenance is collective, is everyone participating, everyone contributing, everyone reinforcing the system by comparing, by displaying, by performing, by caring about position, and the caring is what makes the prison work, is what keeps everyone trapped, is what ensures that suffering continues, that anxiety persists, that peace remains impossible as long as comparison continues, as long as others are visible, as long as position matters, and position will always matter, will always be salient, will always be the measure that counts. Because humans are social, are hierarchical, are wired to care about rank, about status, about where they stand relative to others. And the relative is the only measurement that has ever mattered, is the only comparison that counts, is the prison that has no walls but is inescapable, is the trap that has no lock but cannot be opened, is the suffering that has no cause except comparison, except the presence of others, except the visibility of their position. And the position is always visible, is always present, is always there to measure against, to fall short of, to suffer from the awareness that someone is higher, someone has more, someone is better. And the better is what one is not, is what one is lacking, is what the comparison reveals. And the revealing is the suffering, is the prison, is the condition that cannot be escaped as long as comparison continues, and comparison will continue, must continue, is built into the architecture of social existence, is the foundation of the hierarchy, is the mechanism that assigns position. And position is everything, is worth, is identity, is the measure of the self. And the self is always being measured, always being compared, always being found insufficient. And the insufficient is the prison, is the trap, is the suffering that is universal, that is inescapable, that is the cost of being social, of being visible, of being in comparison with others. And the comparison is the prison, and the prison is where everyone lives, where everyone suffers, where peace is impossible and enough is never enough. There are no moral rules, no principles that hold across all situations, no universal guidelines that can be written down and followed like instructions for assembling furniture. And this is not because morality is arbitrary or because ethics collapses into relativism, but because the moral quality of an action depends entirely on context, on the particular features of the particular situation, on the way reasons interact and combine and transform each other in ways that resist codification, resist generalization, resist the kind of systematic thinking that philosophy has pursued for thousands of years. Jonathan Dancy calls this moral particularism, the view that ethical judgment does not require principles, that one can be a perfectly competent moral agent without believing in rules, without consulting maxims, without checking whether an action conforms to some universal law. Because morality emerges from the details, from the specific configuration of factors that make this situation different from every other situation, and what is right here may be wrong there. Not because the rule changed, but because there was never a rule to begin with, only the illusion of one, only the human tendency to see patterns where there is only particularity, only the desperate need for certainty in a domain that offers none. Aristotle glimpsed this. He said that ethics was not like mathematics, that it dealt with things that held for the most part, that moral judgment required phronesis, practical wisdom, the ability to perceive what matters in a situation and respond appropriately. And this could not be reduced to rule following, could not be taught through principles alone, because wisdom was about seeing, about recognizing the morally salient features, about knowing which factors counted and which did not. And this knowledge came from experience, from immersion in the messy particularity of human life, from confronting situations that resisted easy categorization, that demanded attention to what was actually there, rather than what the theory said should be there. Kant tried to eliminate this messiness. He wanted ethics to be like geometry, certain and universal and necessary, and he argued that moral worth came only from acting according to principle, from following the categorical imperative, from treating humanity as an end and never merely as a means. And this sounded rigorous. It sounded like progress, like philosophy finally getting serious about ethics. But Dancy argues that Kant's entire project was misconceived, that the search for moral principles was a mistake from the start, that principles do not capture what matters morally. They obscure it. They force attention away from the particular situation and toward abstract rules that may not apply, that may distort judgment rather than guide it. Consider lying. Kant said lying was always wrong, always a violation of duty, always impermissible regardless of consequences. And this seems clear, seems like the kind of principle ethics needs. But Dancy asks us to imagine cases. A murderer comes to the door and asks where your friend is hiding. Do you tell the truth? Do you follow the principle, even when it leads to horror? And Kant, remarkably, said that lying was wrong, even here, even when truth enables murder. And this is where the principle reveals its inadequacy, its blindness to context, its inability to track what actually matters in the situation, which is not the abstract wrongness of lying, but the concrete reality of a life in danger, of a choice between honesty and complicity in violence. Mill tried to fix this with consequentialism, with the principle of utility, the idea that actions are right insofar as they promote happiness and wrong insofar as they promote suffering. And this seems more flexible, more sensitive to outcomes, more attuned to what actually matters. But Dancy argues that consequentialism is just another form of generalism, another attempt to reduce morality to a principle. And the principle fails in the same way. It forces all situations through a single lens. It demands that everything be translated into units of pleasure and pain. It ignores the particular features that make one situation different from another, the commitments and relationships and histories that shape what is owed to whom, that make some considerations relevant and others not. And no principle can capture this. No rule can account for the holism of reasons, the way moral factors interact in ways that are not additive, not combinable according to fixed formulas, but emergent, context-dependent, irreducibly particular. The holism of reasons is Dancy's central insight, the idea that a feature that counts in favour of an action in one context might count against it in another, or might be morally neutral in a third. And this is not because the principle changed, but because there is no principle, only the way reasons function in concrete situations. Consider pleasure. It seems like a good-making feature, something that counts in favour of an action, but the pleasure taken in another's suffering is not good, it is contemptible. It transforms what might have been a reason into something else entirely, and this transformation is not rule-governed. It emerges from the particular configuration of features, from the relationship between pleasure and cruelty, between satisfaction and harm. And no principle can predict this in advance. No rule can tell you when pleasure counts positively and when it does not, because the answer depends on details that resist formalization, that require attention to the specific case, to the particular way elements combine and interact and generate moral significance. Ross saw this problem and tried to solve it with prima facie duties, with the idea that principles hold other things being equal, that there are multiple duties that can conflict, and when they conflict one must judge which is weightier in the particular situation. And this seems like a compromise between generalism and particularism, a way to preserve principles while acknowledging context. But Dancy argues that prima facie duties do not solve the problem, they only relocate it, because the judgment of which duty is weightier is itself particularist. It requires attention to the specific features of the situation. It requires exactly the kind of moral perception that particularism emphasizes. And if that perception is doing all the work, if the real moral judgment happens when deciding between competing duties, then the principles are not guiding action. They are just labels for types of considerations, and the substantive work is being done by particularist judgment, by the ability to see what matters here and now, not by consulting rules, but by attending to reality. Hare tried to rescue generalism with supervenience, with the idea that if two situations are identical in their natural properties, they must be identical in their moral properties, that moral facts supervene on natural facts. And this seems right. It seems like a minimal constraint on moral judgment that one cannot say this action is right, and that action is wrong if they are exactly the same in every non-moral respect. But Dante accepts supervenience while denying that it entails generalism, because supervenience is just the claim that morality is not arbitrary, that it tracks features of situations, but it does not follow that those features function according to principles, that they behave the same way in every context, that they can be codified into rules. And this is the crucial distinction between the idea that morality is reason responsive, that it answers to facts about situations, and the idea that it is principle-based, that it can be systematized into universal laws. And Dante argues that the first is true and the second is false, that ethics is responsive to reasons without being governed by principles, that judgment can be rational without being rule-following, that one can give explanations for moral claims without appealing to generalizations. This seems strange. It seems like judgment without principles must be arbitrary, must be mere intuition, mere feeling, mere subjective response. And this is the standard objection to particularism, the charge that it collapses into relativism or emotivism or some form of irrationalism. But Dante insists that particularist judgment is rational, that it can be defended, can be explained, can be argued for. But the defense does not take the form of deriving the judgment from a principle. It takes the form of pointing to features of the situation, of saying, look at this, see how it matters, see how it combines with that to generate this moral requirement. And this is not irrational. It is not arbitrary. It is simply a different form of rationality, one that operates at the level of the particular rather than the universal, one that trusts perception rather than deduction, one that recognizes that moral reality is too complex, too context-dependent, too holistic to be captured in rules. Wittgenstein would have recognized this. His discussions of rule-following showed that rules do not apply themselves, that every application of a rule requires interpretation, requires judgment about whether this case falls under the rule, and that judgment cannot itself be rule-governed on pain of infinite regress. And this means that, at some point, judgment must be direct, must be a matter of seeing how to go on, of recognizing the similarity or difference without consulting a further rule. And if this is true for linguistic rules, it is even more true for moral rules, where the situations are more complex, the factors more numerous, the interactions more unpredictable, and the idea that one could capture all of this in a set of principles seems not just difficult, but incoherent, seems to misunderstand what morality is, how it functions, what it demands of moral agents. McDowell follows this line. He argues that moral knowledge is perceptual, that the virtuous person sees what is required, sees the morally salient features the way one might see that a painting is balanced, or that a joke is cruel. And this seeing is not mediated by principles, it is direct responsiveness to features of the situation. And someone who lacks this responsiveness, who cannot see what matters, cannot be helped by being given rules. Because the problem is not that they do not know the rules, but that they do not see what the rules are supposed to be about. They lack the sensibility that makes moral judgment possible. And this sensibility is developed through experience, through habituation, through becoming the kind of person who attends to certain features and responds to them appropriately. And this is not a matter of internalizing principles, but of refining perception, of learning to see what matters and why it matters and how it matters in this particular case. But if morality does not require principles, if particularism is true, then what happens to moral education, to the teaching of ethics, to the possibility of moral progress and moral reform? Because it seems like without principles, there is no way to criticize existing practices, no standpoint from which to say that this is wrong, no foundation for moral argument. And Dante's response is that criticism does not require principles, that one can point to features of a situation and show that they matter, that they generate reasons, that current practice fails to recognize them. And this is how moral progress happens, not through the discovery of new principles, but through the expansion of moral perception, through learning to see what was always there but previously ignored, like the suffering of animals, like the dignity of marginalized groups, like the long-term consequences of environmental destruction. And these insights are not derived from principles, but from attention to particulars, from refusing to look away, from recognizing that features previously dismissed as irrelevant are in fact morally significant. And this recognition does not require a theory, it requires only the willingness to look, to attend, to respond. Murdoch understood this deeply. She argued that morality was about attention, about the quality of consciousness one brings to situations, about whether one sees clearly or through the distorting lens of selfishness, fear, resentment, pride. And the moral task was not to follow rules, but to purify vision, to remove the obstacles that prevent one from seeing reality as it is. And this was a lifetime's work, a continuous effort of reorientation, of turning away from fantasy and toward truth. And principles could not do this work. They could not force vision. They could not compel attention. They were at best crude summaries of what attentive people had noticed, and at worst they were substitutes for attention, shortcuts that allowed people to think they were being moral without actually looking at what was in front of them, without confronting the particular human being, the particular situation, the particular constellation of factors that demanded response. Levinas took this even further. He argued that ethics began not with principles, but with the face of the other, with the encounter that precedes all theory, all system, all generalization, and the face makes a demand, a wordless claim that cannot be ignored, cannot be systematized, cannot be reduced to rules, and responsibility emerges in that encounter, not from duty, not from utility, not from virtue, but from the sheer fact of the other's vulnerability, the other's dependence, the other's irreplaceable singularity. And every attempt to capture this in principles misses what matters, abstracts away the particular person standing before you, replaces the face with a category, replaces the singular with the general. And this is not ethical thinking, but it's evasion, not responsibility, but the flight from responsibility into the comfort of rules that tell you what to do. So you do not have to look, do not have to see, do not have to respond to what is actually there. Yet the pull toward principles persists, the need to generalize, to systematize, to find order in the chaos of moral life. And this need is not irrational, it reflects something deep in human cognition, the tendency to abstract, to categorize, to find patterns, and in many domains this serves us well. Science progresses through generalization, through finding laws that apply across cases, through ignoring particularity in favor of universality. But Dancy argues that ethics is not like science, that moral properties do not behave like natural properties, that the search for moral laws is misguided not because we have not found them yet, but because they do not exist, because the moral domain is constitutively particular, irreducibly context-dependent, resistant to the kind of systematization that works elsewhere. This does not mean ethics is subjective, does not mean moral judgments are arbitrary, does not mean anything goes. It means only that moral truth is complex, that it emerges from the interplay of factors in particular situations, that it requires attention and judgment rather than calculation and rule following. And the person who wants certainty, who wants an algorithm for ethics, who wants to know in advance what the right answer is asking for something ethics cannot provide. Not because ethics is deficient, but because that is not what ethics is, not what it has ever been, not what it could be without ceasing to be about the messy, complicated, particular reality of human life. The implications of this extend into every corner of moral philosophy, into debates about action and character, about consequentialism and deontology, about the nature of reasons and the structure of normativity. Because if particularism is true, then the entire framework of traditional ethics must be reconsidered. The search for supreme principles abandoned, the hope for moral certainty relinquished, the dream of ethics as a deductive science dissolved, and what replaces it is something humbler, something more difficult, something that requires not cleverness but wisdom, not logic but perception, not theory but attention to the infinite complexity of actual situations. And this is harder, requires more from moral agents, demands that they develop sensitivity rather than memorize rules, that they cultivate character rather than learn formulas, that they become the kind of people who can see what matters rather than the kind who can apply principles. And this cannot be taught in classrooms, cannot be reduced to curriculum, cannot be tested with examinations. It requires living, requires experience, requires the slow accumulation of cases and responses and reflections that gradually shape perception, that refine judgment, that make one capable of navigating moral reality without the crutch of principles. Consider promising. It seems like a clear case for principles. You ought to keep your promises. Seems as close to a moral rule as anything gets. And yet even here context intrudes. A promise made under duress does not bind. A promise to do something immoral should be broken. A promise that circumstances have rendered impossible does not generate obligation. And the more one examines promising, the more exceptions appear, the more qualifications are needed. And at some point the principle becomes so hedged with caveats that it ceases to be a principle at all. It becomes merely a placeholder, a reminder that promises generally matter. But the real work is done by judgment, by the ability to see which features of this particular promise are morally relevant, whether it was freely given, whether circumstances have changed, whether keeping it would cause harm, whether breaking it would violate trust. And these considerations do not combine according to a formula. They do not add up mechanically. They interact holistically, each modifying the significance of the others. And the person who simply applies a rule about promise keeping without attending to these particulars is not being moral. They're being obtuse. They are substituting mechanical rule following for genuine ethical response. The same pattern appears everywhere, in questions of truth-telling and confidentiality, of loyalty and fairness, of care and justice. Every apparent principle dissolves under scrutiny into a complex web of context, dependent considerations, and the moral agent must navigate this web without a map, must see what matters without consulting a guidebook, must respond to reality as it is rather than as theories say it should be. And this is difficult. This is uncertain. This leaves room for disagreement and error, but it is also more honest, more true to actual moral experience, more respectful of the complexity of human life than any theory that tries to reduce ethics to a set of rules that can be mechanically applied. Nietzsche saw the damage that moral principles could do, the way they flattened life, reduced rich particular situations to instances of abstract categories, forced living, breathing human interactions into rigid molds. And he attacked what he called slave morality, the morality of rules and duties and universal principles. Not because he thought ethics was impossible, but because he thought this kind of ethics was life-denying. It served the weak at the expense of the strong. It suppressed excellence in favor of equality. It demanded conformity rather than creativity. And true morality, Nietzsche thought, would be particular, would be about the individual creating their own values in response to their own situation, about saying yes to life in all its particularity rather than subjecting it to the tyranny of universal laws. And while Dantzi would not follow Nietzsche all the way into this radical individualism, there is something shared here, a recognition that principles can be oppressive, that they can prevent genuine moral response, that attention to particulars is not a failure of ethics but its essence. Yet there remains the worry about disagreement, because if morality is not governed by principles, then what happens when people disagree? How can disputes be resolved? What court of appeal exists? And the generalist thinks principles solve this? That if both parties accept the same principles, they can reason their way to agreement. But this assumes that moral disagreement is always about the application of shared principles, and often it is not. Often people disagree about what matters, about which features are salient, about how considerations combine. And in these cases, principles do not help. They just disguise the disagreement, make it look like a technical dispute about application, when really it is a substantive dispute about perception. And the particularist accepts this, accepts that some disagreements cannot be resolved by argument, that they reflect different ways of seeing, different sensibilities, different forms of attention. And this is not relativism, because it does not deny that one view might be right and the other wrong. It just denies that the rightness can always be demonstrated through principles, that it can always be made compelling to someone who does not already see what matters. And this means that moral education is not about teaching principles, but about training perception, about learning to see what the virtuous person sees. And this is slow, difficult, uncertain work, but it is the only work that matters, the only work that produces genuine moral agents, rather than rule followers who think ethics is about checking boxes and following procedures. The legal system provides a useful contrast, because law requires principles, requires rules that can be codified and applied consistently, requires the ability to determine guilt and innocence through procedures rather than perception. And this is appropriate for law because law serves different purposes. It needs predictability, needs equality before the rules, needs the ability to hold people accountable in ways that do not depend on individual judgment. But morality is not law. Moral judgment is not legal judgment, and the attempt to make morality like law, to replace wisdom with rules, to substitute codification for perception, is a category mistake. It imports into ethics standards that belong elsewhere, that serve different purposes, that distort what morality is actually about, which is responding appropriately to particular situations rather than applying general rules, which is seeing what matters rather than calculating what is required, which is being a certain kind of person rather than following a certain kind of procedure,